welcome everybody to the author-led webinar for Visible Learning for Literacy and Text Complexity, second edition. We're so lucky to have our author, Nancy Frey, on the line to walk us through both of these books. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to become more informed on these two exciting publications. As in the past, we'll be recording the webinar, and we will send a link out to all of you as well as to your colleagues who are unable to make the call. But the book, Text Complexity, has published, and many of you have already received your copies and have started fulfilling orders. And Visible Learning for Literacy is publishing on or around March 16th.
April 1st. April 1st. April 1st.
Oh, April 1st. Thank you, Lisa.
Sure.
So April 1st. And so the pre-publication special for Visible Learning for Literacy is still available. The extra 20% off is available to you prior to the book's publication. And in honor of this webinar, we're keeping the Text Complexity special pricing open for another week as well. So you still have 1 week to send me an order to receive the special pricing on Text Complexity second edition. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Ludicky, who's our publisher of literacy products and programs at Corwin. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about our author and the program. So thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everybody. I know for many of you, Nancy doesn't really need an introduction, but hopefully I will tell you a few things that you don't know today. As you probably do know, she and her collaborator, co-author, Doug Fisher, are two of the most important and prominent leaders in literacy today. They also happen to be the co-authors of Corwin Literacy's Rigorous Reading, Text-Dependent Questions, both the K-5 and 612 volumes, and now the two new books that we're going to learn about today. We're very excited about these new titles. Doug and Nancy have led more than 1,000 in-services and written more than 40 professional books and programs across the K-12 grade span in their careers. And additionally, and this is what you may not know as much about, she is the co-founder and co-leader with Doug of Health Sciences High and Middle College. And that's a public middle and high school in one of the poorest and most diverse parts of San Diego. And so they practice everything they preach in their books every day. I found out a few additional things about their school recently that I was already very impressed by it, having visited it numerous times. But Doug told me a few things before our sales meeting in January, and that is that 78% of their students live in poverty. 99% of their students are either ELLs or redesignated ELLs. And yet 94% of their graduating seniors graduate with between 9 and 18 community college credits. 94% go directly into college or career, and 74% go into 2 to 4 year degree programs. And I should say, you know, 94% of their students going in directly into college or career, that's higher than the national high school graduation rate overall, which is around 80%. Their school was named one of the U.S. News Best High Schools of 2014. In 2013, California Department of Education named it a distinguished school, and it was also the winner of the California Department of Education's Title I Academic Achievement Award. So if you're wondering what they're doing when they're not writing books, now you know. And I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to turn this over now to Nancy.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. And in fact, I am locked securely into an office at right now, and I put a sign up that said, I'll be done at 11 o'clock because we're on Pacific time. I'll be done at 11 o'clock, so I'm hoping that I don't have students that wander in here. But if you hear an interruption, that's what it is. I'm at a high school with 750 kids, and it's a Friday. So welcome to all of you. As Lisa and Erica described, we have two new publications that are coming out. The Visible Learning for Literacy, which we've written in collaboration with John Hattie, who I believe needs no introduction. And then a second one, which is, let me click the slide here, sorry, the text complexity book, which we're seeing as being very complementary with rigorous reading, the text-dependent questions, books that we've already written for Corwin. And as distributors, I imagine that you'll be asked with either one of those publications, what's new about them? How do they fit into the other texts that are available? So I hope to be able to address some of those questions during our time together. But I'm going to start off with talking about Visible Learning for Literacy. And I'll spend some time with kind of developing the content of that and introducing what's new, how does that add to and contribute to the field, and then turn our attention to the text complexity book as well. I'll also make sure to leave time at the end of the webinar so that you can pose questions as well. So I'll start with talking about specifically the Visible Learning for Literacy. And sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with the clicking, but I promise I'll get better at it. For Doug and myself, and John as well, we really believe in this statement. We believe deeply that every student deserves to have a great teacher, not by chance, but by design. As Lisa had explained earlier, we live the learning lives of 750 6th through 12th graders that we have the honor to be able to serve here at our school. And this is something that drives our practices every day. How is it that we can make sure, to the best of our abilities, that the teachers who are working so closely with students in the classroom understand what their practices are and understand what the impact of their practices are. And so with that in mind, we've had the good fortune of being able to collaborate with John. And of course, you know his other two publications, especially around visible learning, whether we're talking about the original Visible Learning book or Visible Learning for Teachers. These publications, the work that John has done over the last 15 years or so, have truly been impactful across the world in causing teachers and administrators to look more closely at their practice and to understand how they can increase the impact of what it is that they do with students and how it is that they can measure their impact as well. So I'll start with just a little bit of background about visible learning itself as a refresher, and then I'll move into what's going on with visible learning for literacy. So you, of course, by now are very familiar with the barometer structure that John has set up with visible learning in understanding what impacts are, what effect sizes are. And his effect sizes are really a measure of the amount of, I like to call it the bang for the buck. In other words, how much effect are you likely to get out of all of the work that you're doing? Nobody is saying that teachers aren't working hard enough. But what we do have to do is work smarter, not harder, but work smarter. And so understanding what our impact is and understanding what effect size is has really transformed our practice. Just as a review, you know that a number of practices actually have a reverse effect or a negative effect on students. In fact, they cause harm in one way or another. Other strategies and approaches really just have a developmental effect. In other words, they really aren't having any more impact beyond students aging a year, growing up a year. There are some teacher effects. There are particular approaches that we could probably attribute to the effects that having a teacher in the classroom might have. But what we're really interested in, and what John has sparked our interest in across the field, is in really thinking about how can we position as many of our practices as possible within the zone of desirable effects. And he talks about, from a mathematical standpoint, from a statistical standpoint, what that hinge point is. That hinge point is at the 0.40 level. In other words, that's where we're likely to get a year's worth of growth for every year in school. And as I sit here in the middle of a community that is the most densely populated community in all of San Diego County and has the lowest median age. In other words, there are more young people in this neighborhood than anywhere else in San Diego County. I realize how desperately they need to be able to grow a year for every year that they're in school. We can't afford to allow them to progress at stagnating kinds of levels where they're only making a few months worth of progress for every year that they're in school. You know, when we meet students at 6th grade or 7th grade or 9th grade who are already several years behind, translate that. Translate what it is that it means. If I meet a 6th grader who is reading on a 3rd grade level, that student has made half a year's worth of progress for every year in school. So how is it that we can make sure that we're really increasing our ability to be able to accelerate what it is that students are able to do? And you know from looking at his work that he talks about the dangers, the reverse effect, if you will, of practices like retention. In fact, retention in 1st grade is among the strongest predictors of dropping out in high school. In fact, many large school systems have figured out that in order to project what their dropout rate will be 9 years later, they simply need to keep track of how many 1st graders they have retained each year, because they will have a similar number 9 years later of dropouts. At the developmental level, and here's a really persistent practice that continues to happen despite all the evidence against it, that ability grouping and tracking of students does not have any kind of good effect whatsoever on students. Even with looking at homework, homework has a very differential kind of effect. Overall, it's at a 0.29 level. As you begin to unpack that, it is more effective for older students at the secondary level, actually moves into that zone of desired effects, not especially effective for students at the elementary level. And then we get into those zones where it really does matter what it is that we're doing. And I imagine that in some ways we're preaching to the choir. We know what are some good practices that are out there. Small group learning is incredibly useful for students to engage in. Learning and utilizing study skills has a great effect size. It is not a matter of enrolling kids in a study skills class. In fact, that's been shown to be ineffective, but rather making sure that students get lots of opportunities to apply those study skills. Incredibly useful. Engaging in repeated readings. Reading the same passage more than one time and engaging in what it is that means has a large effect size. The relationships that teachers and students have, those positive relationships, are incredibly useful as well. Classroom discussion, not Q&A, not the teacher interrogating students, but true classroom discussion and discourse. Look at the effect size on that. It's huge. And I hope what you're noticing as I am going through some of these in particular is that these are all related to literacy. Literacy is more than just teaching children how to read. The literacies are reading, writing, speaking, listening, and viewing, and they are infused across the curriculum and across grade levels in many different ways. Small group instruction, classroom discussion, engaging in repeated readings of a text with discussion that goes with it. All of those practices can and should be occurring across grade levels. And then most of all, for the purposes of our conversation, what are the effects when the teacher is clear on what his or her purpose is, translates that to students, communicates that to students, communicates what the success criteria is, what the learning intentions are. All of those have a powerful learning effect on students. So that's kind of a very quick synopsis of some of the visible learning work that's been going on. And as I said, Doug and I have had the good fortune of being able to collaborate with John to look more closely at visible learning, specifically as it applies to literacy. And so when you have customers that are saying, well, how is this book different from some of the visible learning research that has come out already, you can talk about what it is that we really mean by literacy. As I said, the reading, the writing, the speaking, the listening, and the viewing. And so to give you kind of a quick overview of what's going on in the book itself, we, of course, spend time at the beginning of the book talking about how important it is that learning intentions and success criteria are clearly communicated to students, whether they are kindergartners, whether they are 12th graders in an AP course. They need to understand what is the purpose for today and how will I know that I am successful. This really dovetails so tightly with the work that Doug and I have done over the years about teaching with purpose and teaching with intention. And while we're at it, teaching for relevancy, making sure that students understand why it is that we're learning about the things that we're learning about today. I often tell teachers, you know, when we're establishing relevancy in instruction, it doesn't all have to lead to world peace. It doesn't all have to be those really long-range kinds of relevancies. We're allowed to be able to make things relevant to the unit of instruction. Here's why we're learning about this today. It's because this unit that we're in is focused on folktales, and you need to understand how folktales are similar all across the world. That's a relevancy issue, and it helps students to understand, especially, and answer what we consider to be the three major questions related to learning intentions and to success criteria. And those questions are, what am I learning today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know I have learned it? These are the three questions that drive all learners, whether they are 6 years old or whether they are 16 years old, or quite frankly, if they're 36 years old. We always want to know, what am I learning about today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know that I've learned it? Doug and I have actually positioned this really as being even a student's rights kind of questions. Students have a right, if they are going to be evaluated and graded on the learning that they do in school, they have a right to know what they're learning, why they're learning it, and how they will know that they have learned it. So the first part of the book, first chapter of the book, really takes into consideration what learning intentions are, what success criteria are, and importantly, are explained and demonstrated through a variety of scenarios that pepper each one of the chapters to help literacy teachers see how their practices can look, whether we're talking about spotlighting practices of a 4th grade teacher or an 11th grade English teacher, that they're able to see up front and in authentic kinds of ways what those practices look like. Now here's another item that is new for us. In addition to the scenarios that we've been able to utilize. And that is that John and Doug and I have further looked at those practices and have sorted them out into practices that best support surface level knowledge. In other words, acquisition of knowledge. That's an important aspect of learning, but it's certainly not the be-all and the end-all. We have, as another section of the book, what are those literacy practices that help to deepen learning? Once they've acquired the knowledge that they need, how do we begin to consolidate? How do we get them to consolidate that knowledge? This is at the heart of literacy instruction. And then finally, what are those practices that assist students in moving their knowledge to the transfer level? In other words, those kinds of practices that, the kind of knowledge that they can apply pretty much without the teacher standing over them at a moment in time and saying, this is what you do next, that they're able to apply it in situations that are both inside and outside of the classroom. So we'll talk about surface learning versus deep learning. And although we've arranged it because you have to, in a somewhat linear fashion in terms of the way that the chapters roll out, in truth, learning is not as quite of a linear process as might seem to be suggested. Surface learning and deep learning often kind of occur in a back and forth kind of manner. First we acquire some knowledge, some surface learning, and then we go deeper, we begin to consolidate it. And then we go back again and we acquire some more knowledge. Again, we're back to surface learning and then moving forward once again into deep learning. It's really much more recursive than all of that, but the ideas, the concepts around surface learning and deep learning have been around for decades. Surface learning essential for acquisition of knowledge, but deep learning is when they begin to consolidate it. And we always have to be thinking, how can I move this information forward from surface learning to deep learning? Now, having said that, surface learning is really important. We're not diminishing what it is that that teachers do in making sure that their students are acquiring knowledge. They have to be able to acquire knowledge, and they have to have tools in their tool chest that help them to be able to acquire knowledge in ways that are efficient. And teachers can use particular tools and approaches that help with that surface learning. So I'll give you some examples that we explore more deeply in the book. This certainly is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a good idea of what's there. When we're talking about surface learning and matching those to practices that are useful in facilitating the acquisition of knowledge, we're talking about especially the teacher's ability to be able to leverage prior knowledge, huge effect size, to be able to teach vocabulary such that students are acquiring the language of the lesson, the language, the technical language that they need in order to be able to speak toward the content that they're learning. Reading comprehension instruction in context, not strategy of the week. Now we're going to predict, and we're not going to do anything but predicting, but rather doing it in real time within the context of the reading that's going on. I'll share a story from a number of years ago, and some of you may recall when it first became very popular in the field to talk about reading comprehension strategies, and we saw curricularization of those strategies. So, for example, there were programs that were out there, and it would be 6 weeks of determining importance, and we would only do that. And there would be another 4 weeks of visualizing, and so on. In other words, we took those all apart, but the problem is when you take them all apart, they lose their effect. And I was in a classroom one day, and the students were reading a book in which the dog dies. You know, these are very popular in 4th grade, all the Dead Dog series. And they were reading a book, they were near the beginning. It was obvious from the first chapter that the dog had died. It was being told in flashback. And they were on the predicting unit. And the teacher said to them, okay, now I want all of you to all talk together, and I want you to make a prediction. So I went over to a group of boys, and I asked them what they were predicting, and meaning, in other words, what was their prediction going to be. But I said to them, what are you predicting? And one of the students misinterpreted my question and said, everything, man. And that really is the truth. That can be what can happen. We don't want to make sure that the reading comprehension instruction happens within the context. It happens authentically, and we're integrating all of those tools as needed in order to be able to understand a piece of text. Wide reading is another element around surface learning, and certainly a question that we've gotten a lot of questioning about, as well as summarizing. All of these things help to help students acquire knowledge. But we also have to make sure that they go deeper in their knowledge as well. It's fun for me to look at these pictures because these are all pictures of students at our school. And deepening learning, strategies that help with deepening learning include things like concept mapping and really facilitating the discussion and questioning that goes on. Teaching students to utilize metacognitive strategies and then actually having them use them. And reciprocal teaching are just a couple of examples of approaches that are especially effective for deepening learning. But here's an idea to really hang on. Deep learning approaches don't work any better at developing surface learning than surface learning strategies work to develop deep understanding. In other words, we need to be better. We need to be more strategic in, first of all, understanding when our students are in surface learning, they're acquiring knowledge, versus when they're in deep learning. And then further, to be able to match the instruction that we're doing to either facilitate acquisition of knowledge or consolidation of knowledge. Which leads us to transfer. And transfer is something that the field continues to kind of struggle with and figure out. The ideas around transfer have been around again for decades, and folks like Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, the late Grant Wiggins, have really done a lot of work around what transfer looks like. And they say the ability to transfer is arguably the long-term aim of all education. You truly understand and excel when you can take what you've learned in one way or context and use it in another on your own. And all of us as educators want to be able to teach toward transfer. I'll give you a couple of examples from the school where we work, and these, by the way, are in the chapter as well. Our teachers at our school in 9th grade, 10th grade, and then what we call upper division, which is 11th and 12th grade, selected a couple of transfer goals. This is not everything that was ever invented around speaking and listening. But in 9th grade, for example, a transfer goal is that by the end of the year, they want to make sure that their students know how to listen to somebody who knows something that you don't know and ask clarifying questions. Right? That's a transfer goal. That goes across all of their content areas. Around writing, they also selected a transfer goal, and I'll look at the upper division one, that they want their students to be able to introduce, select, and justify evidence from multiple sources to support a claim or a thesis using a specific critical stance to convey their thinking in the mode appropriate to the task. It's in words, or it's in symbols, or it's in pictures. That's a transfer goal. And ways to facilitate transfer in literacy include encouraging students to read across documents and to be able to conceptually organize the information that's in there, especially in noting similarities and differences between multiple documents. That students can engage in formal discussion, not just classroom discussion, but formal discussion that include things like debates and Socratic seminars. That they engage in problem-solving teaching. That's an important aspect of this. Problem-solving teaching, or in some cases what is referred to as PBL, or problem-based learning, is not effective when you're talking about acquisition of knowledge. But using those kinds of approaches at the right time, in this case to facilitate transfer, you see how the effect size goes up. It's not that it is never effective at any time in this particular case, but rather that it may not be well matched with where students are in their learning. And then extended writing. Writing certainly is evidence of those highest levels of complexity that they're engaged in. What we're really talking about in this book is using the right approach at the right time for the right type of learning, being much more precise about what it is that students are doing and teachers understanding why it is that they're doing it. We really believe that rigor is for everyone. We want to make sure that we understand what happens when we differentiate. And this is another aspect of the conversation that we have within the book, is looking at the difference between difficulty and complexity, because those two words often get used interchangeably, and they really aren't. Difficulty is a measure of the effort required to complete a task. But complexity is a measure of the thinking and the action and the knowledge that's needed to complete a task. In other words, the complexity has to do with the number of cognitive and metacognitive steps that you need in order to be able to complete a task. So I'll use as a simple example something that may or may not be difficult, but is definitely not complex. Selecting the meaning of that word might be difficult if you have never heard that word. If you are an English language learner who is new to the language, but it's not complex. You either know it or you don't know it. It is a one-step process. What's that word? What's the definition of that word? Here's one that's a little bit more complex, and it has to do with a car odometer. This is, by the way, an 8th grade math task. If you know anything about estimation, then you can answer this question. You don't actually need a calculator, but it does require moving through several mental steps in order to be able to do so. This is a more complex task than the previous one that I showed you. And knowing the difference between difficulty and complexity helps in the task design that's happening. We as a society, unfortunately, are really enamored with hard tasks. I think about this guy who broke the Guinness Book of World Records for the greatest memory. Are you ready for this? He looked at 59 decks of cards one time only and then memorized them in order. That's an amazing feat. It's a difficult task. And it might beg the question, why would you want to do that? But it's not necessarily a complex task because it's recall only. It's recall and recognition. We need to be more strategic about understanding the relationship between complexity and difficulty. And there are tasks that have low difficulty and low complexity, and those tasks build fluency. Do you see how that relates to surface learning? And there are tasks that are more difficult but not terribly complex that relate to stamina building. We need fluency and we need stamina building activities in literacy. But these are often at the surface level approach. We also need students to engage in tasks that might be more complex but not necessarily difficult. And that's when we're doing, for example, that reading comprehension in context. We're encouraging that strategic thinking that's going on. Now we're deepening their knowledge. And there are times when students need to engage in highly difficult and highly complex tasks because we're building their expertise. So examples of this, at the fluency level, copying notes in a lecture is low difficulty and low complexity, but there is a fluency element to all of that. There are times where we have students doing timed reading tasks to build their stamina. There are times when we have students study their notes. Remember the effect size on study skills? Here it is. This is when we're deepening their knowledge. And at the expertise level, being able to analyze arguments, being able to put those into conceptual organization, to be able to notice differences as well as similarities. That's when we're building their expertise and we're deepening their knowledge. So think of the bottom two elements as the surface learning, super important to be able to do, and then how it is that we move them up above that x-axis to strategic thinking and expertise. That's how we're deepening their learning. What we want to make sure is that, especially when it comes to differentiation, that we're making sure that we're differentiating according to the difficulty and not the complexity. We're not taking the complexity of thought away from students. The last portion of the book talks about how teachers determine their impact. And yes, there is math in this literacy book. And we talk about in those final chapters how it is that teachers can determine their effect size with a group of students or with individuals as well. And of course, this all has to do with pre-test and post-test and being able to measure one's impact. So some examples that we used, that we acquired here at school, we had a group of teachers that were teaching about writing for argument. They did pre-test and post-test so that they would be able to measure what their effect size was. And because they came up with an effect size of 0.771, they were able to note that their instruction during that unit had a good effect size on them. This is actually some of the data that they collected. You can put these all into an Excel document and it will calculate it for you. So their effect size for them, for that instruction, was at the 0.77 level. Another group of teachers were teaching around public speaking skills, and what they noted was that despite their efforts in looking at the pretest and the post-test, their effect size was only 0.30. And one of the teachers commented, they don't seem to be getting much better at this. So of course we had to have conversation about they versus us, we, and taking responsibility for what that instruction looks like. What they did in realizing that they weren't making much of an impact on what they were doing is that they made some adjustments to the unit. They changed what that unit of instruction was in an effort to be able to improve their effect size. And when they met again several weeks later, what they were able to find out was that they had increased their effect size to 0.75. They had moved into that zone of desired effects. So while John's work has talked so much about the meta-analyses and what this looks like in terms of big numbers, we also want to make sure that teachers understand that they can look at their effect size as well, that it doesn't need to involve 32,000 kids. It can involve the 32 kids that you have in front of you. What these teachers realized in working with effect size is that pre-assessments were essential, that their the opportunities to analyze their impact increase the amount of collaboration, that they had. They got better at differentiating what it was that students were doing in the classroom by complexity rather than by difficulty. They increased the amount of small group instruction that was going on, yay, and they abandoned lessons when the students had already demonstrated mastery. In other words, they weren't wasting time in doing it. So that is my, that's my hurry up with talking about what's going on in the Visible Learning for Literacy book, surface learning, deep learning, transfer learning, and then measuring one's impact are the major features that are in this text. We'll turn our attention more briefly towards the text complexity book. This is a second edition of a book that we had originally written in 2012, right at the beginning of the language around Common Core coming out. But what we did realize, too, is that there has been some really epic changes that have happened in the field over the last several years with the introduction of the Common Core. And I know that not every state or every region has adopted the Common Core. However, what we've all seen is that the language of the Common Core has changed the conversation in places all around the world about what is expected. And we realized that there have been lots of instructional practices that have happened since 2010. I was in a kindergarten classroom and took a picture of a language chart that was hanging on the wall that they had obviously done some recent past. And it occurred to me as a former kindergarten teacher that it never would have happened in my classroom that I would have been pressing my kindergartners for evidence. And yet here in this classroom, it was clear that that's exactly the language that those students were using and that teacher was using. There have been some profound changes that have occurred in this decade because of our deeper understanding about text complexity. So in answer to your customers who are saying, okay, what's new about this book? How is this book different from the first edition? In this book, we spend more time looking at close reading as a practice itself. In the previous book, we didn't have much information in there about close reading. And so in this book, we've wanted to make sure that those opportunities for close and critical reading are discussed more thoroughly in there. One of my colleagues likes to say, for those naysayers that aren't sure that their students can engage in close reading, he says, if you want to see a kid reading closely, watch him read a love note, right? They can really read very, very closely in those circumstances. Other things that are new in there. In the previous edition, we had language in there about learning how to assess text, and those are still present in this edition as well. We have a chapter on quantitative measures and how it is that text are assessed quantitatively. Those qualitative values in the task and reader considerations, we have expanded considerably. These are the qualitative elements of text analysis that we talk about with levels of meaning and structure, the language conventions and clarity that a text offers, as well as the knowledge demands. And a new feature that we have in this book is in expanding what those qualitative rubrics look like, so that now there is a rubric, a qualitative rubric that is specifically for literary text, and there is a separate rubric that is specifically for informational text. And I did a few comparisons and contrast there. I'll talk about just the first one that's on there. In literary text, figurative language is often used, but we don't see a lot of figurative language being used in informational text. However, what we do see are a lot of analogies and abstract comparisons. And so these two tools are meant to equip teachers with the ability to be able to look at either literary text or to look at informational text and note what are those areas that they're going to be able to need to teach toward. And that's the point of doing that qualitative analysis. It helps you to locate your teaching points while moving past the things that you realize are not going to be a particular challenge for your students. Another aspect that is new in this edition is in looking at the task and the reader and the text and how it is that those all interface with one another. Among the tools that we've put in there are some decision pathways for selecting text, because we realize as you look across those three paths that are there, we realize that teachers will choose text for three different reasons, three different possible reasons. In some cases, it's because I think this is a fantastic text. It's To Kill a Mockingbird. I am a ninth grade English teacher. We always read To Kill a Mockingbird in ninth grade. That might be that teacher's entry point into decisions. On the other hand, there are times when teachers are saying, my students really need reading instruction about. So in that case, they're not choosing the text first. They're thinking about the strategic thinking that students need instruction on. And a third possible path is I want to build their knowledge about something. So I'm thinking about a text in terms of the content itself. In each of those cases, what we've done is walk them through a way in being able to consider not only what the text has to offer, but what is its suitability given the task that you want to use that text for. We also have a tool in there for helping them to make decisions about the task that they're going to be doing. Which tasks are going to be teacher-led tasks versus peer tasks versus individual tasks? How is it that we're moving those students from surface to deeper knowledge? And then finally, another element that we offer in this book really coincides and coordinates well with the content in both rigorous reading as well as in text-dependent questions. And that is bringing into the text knowledge of what those text-dependent questions are going to be at the literal level, at the structural level, and at the inferential level. In other words, what does the text say, how does the text work, and what does the text mean? In making sure that these elements are present, we are looking to further complement other texts that readers may have so that we can begin to create a more continuity in concept across the way. And so with that, I'm actually going to turn this over to all of you because I've been talking for a while, talking about what are some things that are new in Visible Learning for Literacy, as well as in the second edition of Text Complexity. So I'll put this back to either Lisa or Erica or David, and would love to hear some of your questions for any of us, not just for me, for any of us.
Thank you, Nancy. That was so informative. I have such a better understanding not only of the Visible Literacy Learning for Literacy book, but also Visible Learning in general. So thank you for that introduction. And David has unmuted everybody who is on the call. So if any of our distributors would like to ask a question, you are able to do so now. Anybody?
You can also ask the question through the chat feature or the Q&A box, and we'll go ahead and ask Nancy for you if she can see that.
Okay. So can somebody just, Catherine, can you say something so I know if we can hear you?
QEP is here.
Okay. So then we can hear people, but, oh, let's see. No questions. Okay. You guys are so cute. Okay, so it seems as though everybody has a thorough understanding of the topics covered in the Visible Learning for Literacy book and what's new to the Text Complexity book, which is a second edition of the book formerly published by IRA. And so now it's published by Corwin, and it's the second edition. Text Complexity second edition is currently available for purchase. We're extending the additional pre-pub discount for 1 week. So your order must be into me by Friday, a week from today, in order to receive that extra discount. And Visible Learning for Literacy will publish on April 1st, and the additional 20% discount will be available on that through April 1st as well. So since there are no additional questions, I'd like to take this time to thank you all for signing on and getting a better understanding of these two books. I'd like to thank Nancy for her time, not only in giving the webinar, but for preparing the slides in such a thoughtful and focused way. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Oh, you're welcome.
I also want to thank our back office team, Rebecca Eaton and Margaret O'Connor, who do the marketing and communications work for these books. David Galinato, who is all things wonderful. Thank you, David, for helping with the webinar. I want to give a special shout out to Lisa Ludicky, our publisher, for the literacy products and programs. She's the mastermind behind all of this. Thank you. And I appreciate all that you do, both internal Corwin people and our external Corwin distributors. Thank you for your time and for your business, and I look forward to talking to you all soon.
Erica, thank you from all of us. That was a very, and Nancy, you too, Lisa, everybody, that was a very great webinar.
Thank you. I appreciate your kind words.
Absolutely. Look forward to selling the books.
Thanks
so
much from Intact. Thanks, Nancy.
Bye, guys. Thanks.